Hello, everybody, and welcome to this webinar. I hope you can see us and hear us well. It is our pleasure to have this webinar where we will be addressing the most recent events in relation to the US and the EU relations with Iran in a very timely, in a very important moment. I am very happy to host this webinar together with my dear colleague, Reinhard Bütikofer. The past few months have been very challenging in the relationships between Iran and the US and also the EU, particularly following the missile attacks and the killing of Soleimani at the beginning of the year. The next months to come will be equally crucial for the future of our relations in light of a number of critical events, starting with this month's awaited UN Secretary General's report on the implementation on the Iran nuclear deal. Since the Trump administration withdrawal from the JCPOA over 2 years ago, the EU has tried to keep the pieces of the deal together in order to avoid further destabilization in the Gulf region. However, EU initiatives have had limited impact, and the US contrasting strategy towards Iran has not proven to deliver any result. Following last February parliamentary elections in Iran, where conservatives made significant gains, and the upcoming US presidential elections, restarting diplomatic relations between the two seems unrealistic, and all that can be hoped for is that tensions do not escalate further in the coming months. In the meantime, the EU cannot remain, in our opinion, a passive observer and should use this opportunity to rework its strategy on how to engage with Iran in a way that produces stability in the region in the first place, while managing a delicate diplomacy with the US. Let me introduce to you our outstanding speakers who will provide deeply insights and analysis into these questions today. And I'm very happy to welcome them. First of all, Cornelius Adebar. He's a non-resident fellow at the Carnegie Europe. Cornelius, thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Barbara Slavin is the director of the Future of Iran initiative at the Atlantic Council. Thank you, Barbara, for being with us today as well.
Pleasure.
And Adnan Tabatabai, co-founder and CEO of the Center for Applied Research in partnership with the Orient. Adnan, thank you so much for being with us today as well.
Thanks for having me.
Before kicking off the discussion, allow me to give you just a number of practical informations. The webinar is compliant with the EU data protection standards and will be recorded. You can ask questions throughout the duration of the event by clicking on the chat button located below the speakers, or by using the raise your hand button located above the speakers. I'm sure that many of you have already been used to use all these tools. We will be collecting your questions to be asked during the question and answer session. And without further ado, I will give the floor to my dear colleague Reinhard Bütikofer, who is the coordinator for the Green Group in the Foreign Affairs Committee, and with whom I'm very glad to be hosting this event. Reinhard, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Ernest. I would also like to welcome our experts, but of course also our audience. We're happy to be able to host this event, and we will jump right into it. We have given all of our experts above 10 minutes each to give their own perspective. After that, we will start the Q&A part of the conversation. So bear with us, and I will start immediately without further ado by calling upon Cornelius Adebar to be the first to take the floor. Please.
Thank you very much, Reinhard Bütikofer. Thank you, Ernest Ukasun. Thanks, my dear panelist colleagues, and thanks to the audience for joining this webinar. It's a very timely moment, as was said, and if you look at the events that took place earlier this year, and if you take into account what will await us later this year, it really looks like a difficult time, not just for Europe, but in particular for European-Iranian relations. It may, in this respect, be a little bit of a counterpoint that I'm trying to make here by arguing that, yes, precisely in this moment, the European Union should rethink its strategy towards Iran and should indeed regionalize its approach to Iran. Why am I saying this? The reason is the number of events in the region that have also impacted on the cornerstone of the EU's Iran policy so far, which is the nuclear deal. When the United States left the nuclear deal 2 years ago, they argued that this was also because of Iran's growing influence in the region, because of its power projection, and because the deal, in their view, in the United States' view, had not fulfilled its promise to make Iran more compliant in the region. We all know that this was one part of the preamble, but other than that, the deal itself did not venture into regional affairs or regional security. So one should not blame the deal for not achieving this. But it's true that the fact that Iran has expanded its reach, that we've seen a number of attacks on oil infrastructure and tankers over the past year, of rocket attacks, of Iran's role in Syria, all this does impact on how the deal is seen. It was a very good move during those negotiations to compartmentalize issues, the negotiations that led to the 2015 deal, to look at only the issues that you can solve and do so in the multilateral setting that was made. But in reality, the regional dimension does come in. However, so that is the reason why the EU needs to address these issues and cannot simply deal with a nuclear deal in itself. However, I argue also that the deal provides for such a regionalization of EU-Iran policy by the very issues that it addresses. When the negotiations were started back in 2003 by the Europeans, Iran was the only country in the region running a nuclear energy or nuclear research program, and this was still the case in 2015 when the deal was concluded. So there was a reason why the Europeans, together with the Americans, the Chinese, and the Russians, the international community, addressed Iran as a problem, or more precisely, the Iranian nuclear program as a problem. Today, we already have a nuclear program, a nuclear energy program on the other side of the Persian Gulf in the United Arab Emirates, where South Korea has built nuclear energy reactors. And we have Saudi Arabia, a country which aspires for at least a nuclear energy program, but which also says that if Iran is allowed, for example, enrichment program, Saudi Arabia should also be allowed an enrichment program, or if Iran were to have a nuclear weapon, Saudi Arabia also wanted to have a nuclear weapon. So clearly the issue, the nuclear issue, has spread across the region. And that's maybe an opening, I argue, for the European Union to address these issues in a regional setting. So to go away from only preserving the deal, as important as it is, but also as impossible as it is in the deteriorating regional environment, to include the regional neighbors, the littoral states around the Persian Gulf in discussions about nuclear safety, an issue which concerns all countries in the vicinity of any nuclear reactor. And now there are 2 already in 2 countries, but also further than that, issues surrounding nuclear cooperation, energy cooperation, and you can take it from there to environmental affairs. And at a very late stage, you could even address regional hard security issues through this. So the idea basically is that, admittedly, this is nothing that the EU could do within a week or within a month or even maybe before the end of the year until important decisions are being taken in another country. But the idea is for the EU to prepare for such a regionalization, to start thinking about how it could address not just Iran and not just the nuclear file, but also address the wider region. This is something where it could or should, in fact, come natural to the EU to think in these regional terms. The EU usually likes to engage in regional cooperation in its immediate neighborhood. It likes to promote regional cooperation in faraway regions like Latin America. But for a number of reasons, it has shied away from doing so around the Persian Gulf. And when I say the Persian Gulf, I actually mean to first look at these particular countries. I'm not talking about the entire Middle East with its plentiful number of conflicts and with the Israeli-Palestine issue as a particular divisive one. I really mean that the EU should look at the sub-region of the Persian Gulf, where there are countries which share this body of water and which share many problems of this stemming from this body of water. So what the European Union could do and should do is start preparing a potential enlargement of its own strategy, looking beyond the bilateral relations, no longer trying the bilateral relations with Iran, no longer trying to square the differences between an Iran which is increasingly in opposition to the deal, which is retracting also from the deal gradually, and the United States on the other side, which is the most important partner of the EU, but which is at loggerheads when it comes to the Iran file. For the past 2 years, the European Union has tried to bridge the difference between these two, and it becomes more and more obvious that there is little, if not no, shared space between Iran and the current US government. So instead of trying in vain to bridge these differences, the EU should prepare for their own initiative to go into the offensive, positively speaking, to make an offer, and this offer should be, in my view, around regional cooperation based on the nuclear deal. This ideally would contribute to changing the escalatory dynamic in the region, simply because it would change the setting if only one big actor started to start an initiative like this. I very much look forward to my colleagues' views and also to discussing with the audience. Thank you.
I had to unmute myself. Thanks, Mr. Adeba. I want to turn over the floor now to our second speaker, Barbara Slavin. The floor is yours.
That's okay. Hi, it's Barbara Slavin, but that's okay.
Slavin.
It's an honor to be part of this with such esteemed colleagues, Cornelius and Adnan. I very much respect their work, and I think the timing is perfect. As Cornelius knows, we at the Atlantic Council have just launched a new project, which is going to try to come up with a new transatlantic framework for approaching Iran. The basis for this is pretty obvious to anybody who has followed this issue for a long time. I was a journalist covering the events of 2002, 2003 and the build up to the Iraq War, when at the same time Iran was discovered to have a more advanced nuclear program than most people had suspected at the time. And of course, the Bush administration then had no interest in speaking to Iran. George W. Bush had just put Iran on a so-called axis of evil in an infamous speech. And so into the breach came the E3, Britain, France, and Germany began a dialogue with Iran on the nuclear question, which prevented a crisis, frankly, until such time as the United States was willing to drop its objections to joining such a conversation. And the E3 +1 became the P5+1, as we call it. So I think this is a very important precedent, and I see that we're in a similar moment in a way. Once again, the United States and Iran are at loggerheads. They are not talking to each other except very tangentially about the release of hostages. We should call them that. And so Europe has institutional ties. It has the individual countries which still have diplomatic relations with Iran. It has the European Union. And more importantly, it has the Joint Commission, of the JCPOA, on which the E3 are represented and the EU are represented. So I think the first job of Europe is to preserve what's left of the JCPOA, to prolong this dispute resolution mechanism process, at least until our elections on November the 3rd, when we may have a very different result than some had feared, and have something there for a possible Biden administration to rejoin. The Democratic nominee has said that he would indeed come back into the JCPOA if Iran would. And the Iranian position has been, yes, that the steps they've taken out of the nuclear deal are all reversible if the United States, if the other parties come into compliance, back into compliance. But there's much more we can do. And I'm quite fascinated by Cornelius's suggestions to get ready for a regional agenda that would, at minimum, perhaps regionalize some of the aspects of the JCPOA, including limits on enrichment, the quantity and quality of enriched uranium, certain monitoring provisions for the IAEA, and this could be expanded to other confidence building measures involving missiles and so on, if one wants to get more ambitious. This kind of initiative could be proposed at the Joint Commission, even though it's there only for JCPOA purposes. Certainly you could propose such an agenda and then reach out to the GCC countries in particular to be part of a broader dialogue on nuclear questions and on confidence building measures. This would be a very useful initiative that could be embraced by a future US administration, especially one that puts more emphasis on diplomacy than on intimidation, which is, let's face it, the main foreign policy tenet of the Trump administration is to try to intimidate people into doing what it wants them to do. It's not a very successful policy, as we've seen. I'd also like to see the Europeans do more on economic issues, certainly providing more assistance over coronavirus, but there's more that can be done through Instex, through the Swiss channel. These are channels that now exist and they've barely been exploited. More should be done to use them. More should be done to provide capital. You know, whether it's the Macron proposal of a $15 billion credit for future oil sales. Why do you need US permission to use your own mechanisms to support diplomacy with Iran? The time has come to tell the United States, to tell the Trump administration, no, we have our own foreign policy, we have our own interests, and we do not accept yours. Finally, on this matter of the arms embargo, which is coming up in October, I think it's very important that Europe stand firm. I was very pleased to see the comments by Josep Borrell the other day that the US has no standing to snap back UN sanctions, having quit the JCPOA 2 years ago. This incredibly convoluted and ridiculous argument that is being put forward by the State Department should be soundly rejected, not just by the EU, but by the E3 and other European countries, but particularly Britain and France, which have the power to snap back at the UN Security Council, should make it very clear that they will reject any such attempt by the United States to do so in October when the arms embargo expires. There can be informal understandings among the United States and its allies about not providing certain materials to Iran. I'm not sure Russia and China will agree, but I think quiet diplomacy rather than intimidation and a fallacious snapback is definitely the way to go. I would say that I welcome suggestions from the audience, from the participants on what else we can put into this new framework that we're putting together. We hope to unveil it just after our election. And even if there's a second Trump administration, I think there will be useful suggestions there because policy toward Iran cannot continue as it is. Maximum pressure has certainly failed. So let me leave it there.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Slavin. And now we hear from Adnan Tabatabai. Please.
Hello, everybody. Thank you to you, Mr. Bütikofer, to you, Ernest, for setting this up, for the team behind the cameras who did the organizational heavy lifting. Thank you to my co-panelists and to the people who attended online. Yeah, this discussion got kicked off in most competent manner by Cornelius and Barbara. Thanks for that. And I basically want to start by discussing the title of our meeting today, which says, how do we engage Iran? And what comes to mind really is, who is we? We used to be EU E3+3 if speaking from Europe, or P5+1 if speaking from outside Europe. That this group of states had a unified position on how to engage Iran. And the question of how to engage Iran was also clear. As Cornelius pointed it out, the idea was to compartmentalize issues that exist with the Islamic Republic, one of which was the nuclear file. And it took 12 years of European effort, first and foremost, to bring this JCPOA, to bring the JCPOA to life. We had people in the highest ranks in Europe, like Secretary General of the European External Action Service, Helga Schmidt, who was, I think, involved in this process throughout the whole 12 years. So there has been a lot of European capital, political capital, invested into this. And the formula of the JCPOA simply was, we start with a rather technical issue where it is easy to verify and measure through an international agency, which is the UN-backed International Atomic Energy Agency, what Iran is doing in its nuclear program. The deal was, Iran, you turn down the scope, widen the transparency, and we will deliver economic relief or sanctions relief. Now, you know the story, the latter didn't happen. So I would say we have to really be clear that since the US administration of Donald Trump, the problem here is not necessarily Iran as such, but the problem is, how is the we defined, how is the transatlantic approach towards Iran? And to me personally, we can of course go back to the years before the JCPOA in what problems existed with Iran, but as I said, from 2013 on, a formula was found which was unified under what I called the we back then, the P5+1 or the EU E3+3, and the JCPOA was the way to go forward. Now, that didn't really work, and I would add to what Cornelius said back then. Obviously, there was some regional opposition to the agreement, which had more to do with the concern of Iran being elevated internationally rather than its nuclear program being confined. That was something that the regional actors, speaking of Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, etc., were demanding, obviously Israel as well. But the concern was rather Iran is now being elevated, so to speak, normalized, and that cannot be in their interests. And but more explicitly, it's really the US approach under President Trump. And I remember very well when German Foreign Minister Heiko Maas went to Washington in his first trip, he sent out a tweet saying the US is more than just the White House. And that is certainly something that needs to be kept in mind, that there is, and Europe should never underestimate that, Barbara already alluded to it, there is a lot of dynamic going on in DC as to what can develop until November 3rd. And Europe should have the courage and needs to have the courage to really define its own interests. And I guess going back to the title, we don't need to necessarily find a new Iran strategy for European policymakers, because there has already been one that was, however, undermined by the Trump administration. And I'm the least to say Europe should break with the transatlantic bond. That would be a stupid suggestion to make. But Europe must not allow to be cornered in a way that trying to safeguard the JCPOA would necessarily mean to object the transatlantic bond, because that really is not the case. The JCPOA is first and foremost about Iran's nuclear program, but it is in essence about nuclear non-proliferation. It is in essence about multilateralism. It is in essence about the important role of the United Nations Security Council resolutions, a UN body like the IAEA. Letting that fall apart means to allow that all these, the value of multilateralism, the value of the UN is severely undermined. The arms embargo was mentioned by Barbara. Think about the danger that after you developed as an international, let's say as the members of the UN Security Council, you developed a strategy, a way to turn Iran's nuclear dispute or to solve the nuclear dispute with Iran diplomatically. And undoing this will basically mean that there is a huge credibility problem for any future arrangement in that regard. But in order to think forward and in order to be constructive, so to speak, and not just complain about what went wrong, I think the suggestions outlined by Cornelius are important in the sense that his approach says don't single out Iran when it comes to the nuclear program. There was some reason to do so a couple years back, but now we have actually a regional dimension to it. What will be difficult, however, is that for Iran, for Iran's security interests, this sub-region of the Middle East would leave out Israel in Iranian security calculations, which means Iran back then supported the idea of weapons of mass destruction free Middle East. I have my doubts that Iran would support an initiative towards weapons of mass destruction free Persian Gulf region, because the idea for Iran, or the main incentive, would have been that Israel would no longer have nuclear weapons. I'm not saying there's no chance to speak to Iran about it, but it's less likely than what we had back then in the run-up to the JCPOA. An additional issue, obviously, is Iran had, I would say, a slightly romanticized view of Europe. There was this idea, if Europe one day really wanted to, it could develop its own position towards Middle East affairs and basically emancipate itself from the US. The lesson of the JCPOA now is that this really does not hold true, except for Josep Borrell, the High Representative of the European Union, and before him, Federica Mogherini. There is no single high-level European official on that rank that has been explicitly rejecting the US approach, and Iran is taking note of that. Obviously, that leads to maybe exaggerated disappointment over the European role, but that exaggeration is coming from hopes that Europe would act differently. In light of what's coming up now, I really think that even if we had President Biden in November winning the election, even then the return to the JCPOA will not be that easy. There are voices in Iran that say, if there was to be a return to the JCPOA, we will ask the US to compensate for the losses and the costs that we had during the 3-4 years that the US did not comply while we were in compliance. I'm not judging whether that is the right thing to say or not, but that's just a reality that has to be dealt with. Furthermore, and that's my last point in order to then close with what Europe should continue doing, what I'm also observing in Tehran, and that goes far beyond the political level, is that the disappointment over the inability to normalize ties with Europe is trickling down to the societal level. I'm speaking in particular of young business entrepreneurs who had their hopes to have basically European investors into, for example, the startup ecosystem in Iran. That didn't happen because European investors shied away from US sanctions and left that field to Chinese companies. And this is a new dimension. The politicians in Iran were positive about China. People never were, but this is slightly changing. This means, final word, Europe will have to invest in order to make sure that the soft power it had in Iran is not lost completely. And I'm happy to discuss how that can be developed. And I'm looking forward to the continuation of the discussion with the audience and my wonderful co-panelists.
Thank you also very much, Mr. Tabatabai. That concludes the first stage of this conversation, and I would now like directly to allow participants of our webinar to come into the conversation. And I saw a first raised hand from Elisabeth Hostkötter. I am unmuting you, and now I think you should be able to speak. Maybe you have to unmute yourselves too.
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Oh, yes, I've just a small or little question about companies doing business. They shy away, as I can remember from the news, and it's good to hear that you say, yes, we should emancipate from the USA and from the Trump administration, but what happens to companies? What would you suggest they should do? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Elisabeth. And now I have a raised hand from a colleague from the European Parliament, Mr. Gala. I'm looking for your name in the list. Just a second. Where is it? Michael Gala. There you go. You're unmute. Sorry.
Yes.
You're unmuted now.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My question is also in the economic field, apart from the what was just asked. There was a discussion earlier in implementing all these measures that we might, in order to avoid US sanctions or interference, we might switch the trade with Iran to euro exchange and thereby bypass other, the dollar zone or all their mechanisms. I'm not familiar with all the details, but do you think that that would be a way to encourage or to encourage companies who are perhaps not trading with the US, but who are trading with Iran only, to be more courageous? And could we, as European Union, then be the ones who provide for the techniques to switch to euro as the exchange mode for trade with Iran?
Then I have somebody, Jutta, where is it? Jutta Guteland. You could speak now, please.
Thank you. Thank you, first of all, for this seminar. I'm in the member in the European Parliament and in the Iran delegation, and also the shadow rapporteur on the S&D group for Iran. Thank you for all the contributions. I also would like to ask more specifically, because I think we are often coming back to the importance of Europe and how to make the EU be more strong and have a Iran policy of its own and not be part of the US strategy. But I also would like to get some more information on how, because we are often stuck in the problem-oriented situation that we are not clear enough. We don't have a voice of our own, but in the same time, I find it often a little bit diffuse on how could we be more self-independent from the US? How could we be more clear? For me, I think we need to be stronger, of course, in our support for the people of Iran, under the difficult situation on this sanction area, that the US sanction is really difficult for the people. And I also would like, of course, the EU to be very clear in the message that we need respect for human rights, and that is a message to Iran, of course. And then I also see that we have many bilateral opportunities to work on environment, both for Iran but also for the EU. And I think we could have a good cooperation there with Iran. But above all, I would like you to elaborate a little bit more on how we can have the voice of our own and how we can avoid being the little brother of US.
Thank you very much. I will give another participant the floor and then read a question that has been sent by mail, and then I will go back to our experts to collect a round of contributions. And the next participant is Pilar Doré. Please. I unmuted you. You should be able to speak. Pilar? Well, maybe there was a mistake. Then I will read the question that Brian H. sent. He asks, can you speak to the challenges of changing strategies on the approach to Iran in short time frames? The maximum pressure campaign is just a few years along, and from the US standpoint, it seems like strategies are changing every few years, while Iran seems to have a more long-term, enduring strategy towards the West and US in comparison. I would propose that we shift the order, and I would like to go to Mrs. Slavin first.
Okay. Well, there are a variety of questions there. Look, I can't tell Europe exactly how it can emancipate itself from US foreign policy. I mean, we have seen some steps. My understanding of the INSTEX mechanism is that it does indeed permit trade that is euro denominated. It's not dollar denominated. The problem is capital. There are not enough euros there to allow Iran to use this mechanism to purchase food, medicine, other goods. And the question is, how do you increase the capital of INSTEX if Iran is not being allowed to export oil to Europe? I sincerely hope that there will be waivers that will be renewed for countries like Italy and Greece to begin purchasing Iranian oil again. I think that's something that we would certainly see if we have a change of administrations in the United States, that even if the sanctions don't come off, all of them immediately, certainly there would be an easing of this maximum pressure campaign, and there would be an ability for Iran's traditional customers for oil to begin buying oil again from Iran. Then there would be capital in INSTEX that Iran could draw on for its own purchases. There was a suggestion by President Macron of France to give Iran a $15 billion credit, whatever the equivalent is in euros these days, so that this could be used also to boost trade between Iran and Europe. Now, if European companies are so terrified that they will not avail themselves of this mechanism, that's another issue. But I think certainly companies that provide pharmaceuticals, medical equipment, material that is not sanctioned by the United States should be willing to go forward if they have an assurance that they are going to be compensated for these sales. And I think there's more that Europe can do in this area, and I don't really understand why. Perhaps my European counterparts can explain why Europe is so reluctant to try to pump up this mechanism. There's also a Swiss channel, which has been blessed by the United States Treasury Department for Swiss companies to sell primarily pharmaceuticals to Iran, and perhaps the Swiss would allow companies from other European countries to avail themselves of this. The Iranians have asked for a $5 billion emergency loan from the International Monetary Fund to help it get through the COVID crisis. And there are enough votes in the IMF to override a US veto of this. This matter is still somehow under study by the IMF and stuck in the bureaucracy. It could be pushed forward as a real sign that Europe is committed, particularly to helping Iran through this very difficult period. Iran should be entitled to get this emergency support when many other countries are getting emergency support from the IMF. And it would be another way to show the Trump administration that their views cannot dictate European policy. So those are just a couple of suggestions. I mean, in terms of human rights and so on, I mean, this is traditionally Europe's strong suit with Iran, and Europe should continue to press on these issues. Europe should continue to offer assistance in areas like the environment. Unfortunately, Iran has put a lot of environmentalists in prison, and so that rather complicates this issue. Europe should press for these people to be freed.
They're greening their prisons, huh?
Deal with. I mean, we all know it makes it very hard, but I still think there are steps that Europe can take that will at least preserve this diplomacy until we get a change in US administrations.
Thank you. Mr. Tabatabai, you go next, please.
Thank you. A lot of points already raised by Barbara, and I think I can fully sympathize with the question of what exactly are we supposed to do. And I have to admit that on the economic front and on the legalities and technicalities that come with it, I really am no expert. And I can just say that for European businesses to continue or to keep business with Iran intact, they need more legal backing, and they need a more conducive political environment in the respective capitals of their countries. So what I'm trying to say is that when European businesses, particularly the internationals and the bigger companies, see the hesitation from the political establishment to really withstand the US approach, which is more or less bullying Europe into compliance, let's really put it this way, then I don't think that European companies would feel that they have the necessary legal protection against US punishments. And I don't know whether switching to euros would solve the issue. As I said, these technicalities I'm unaware of. Instex never really got the necessary one big positive precedent to kick off an avalanche of trade. Europeans tried to basically shied away from saying this tool is there to circumvent US sanctions. The talk has always been this is going to be used for non-sanctioned goods. And then the Iranian side would say, well, we didn't agree on a JCPOA to import things that are non-sanctioned anyway. So that already brought the difficulties in. I unfortunately forgot your last name, dear Jutta, but I think Jutta was your first name, so at least that I kept. On the political front of things, and this is particularly obviously you as a EU official, let us really be open or honest about US politicians adopting some of the language that comes from the US administration, allowing dichotomies to be imposed on European thinking towards Iran. I mentioned earlier that Europeans defending the JCPOA were pushed into the pro-Iran corner, whether that really has nothing to do with being pro-Iran, but rather being in favor of their European interests. So not adopting the language from the US, pushing back more explicitly would signal both to European businesses, but also to the Iranian side that the Europeans have their very own approach towards Iran. And here's one important point that a very great Spanish diplomat explained to me, I wish it was myself coming up with this notion, but I have to cite him. He said that US sanctions do not change Iranian policies, or if, as the US administration likes to say, Iranian behavior. US sanctions change the behavior and policies of countries dealing with Iran. That means the Chinese have a different approach now. The Europeans have a different approach. Iran is pursuing its own policies as if these sanctions don't exist, or are actually exacerbating some of their deterrence work in the region. But what has really changed is how, for example, Europe deals with Iran. Economically, on the business side, that's the private sector. We cannot dictate them what to do. Politically, there is this opportunity to create a climate of emancipating, withstanding US pressure. And going to the question that was handed in via email, it's indeed a short-term approach, or at least it's a very explicit rupture from the Obama years, and so therefore Europe should not so easily allow to adopt this kind of thinking and push back politically. And by pushing back politically, I really am convinced that the environment will also be more conducive for businesses to work with Iran. One final point on the IMF and also on the Swiss channel that Barbara mentioned. Barbara hinted at the fact that the US has given its blessing to the Swiss channel, and there are two reasons for that we should be aware of. The Swiss have the extremely important role of conveying messages back and forth between US and Iran, and the recent prisoner swaps would have not been possible without this invaluable work of the Swiss. But that's a positive reason for the US to give blessing to the Swiss channel. There is also a negative reason, and that is for the US to really say no to Instex, because there is no such blessing for Instex. And for the Swiss to invite European businesses to conduct their business through the Swiss channel would somewhat make Instex, in my view at least, obsolete. And the IMF loan, just let that sink in. There is an opportunity for countries mostly affected by the COVID-19 pandemic to get the money that they are deserved to get because they are members of the IMF, and the US objects to that. And suddenly there is a deadlock at IMF. Here again, Europe can, and I only heard Josep Borrell say that, I will reiterate, only he has been explicit in pushing back against this notion of blocking Iran's loan. More Europeans, be it from the European Parliament or from any other administration, should be much more explicit in saying this is not the way forward in a time of a global pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you also. And then as a third, Mr. Adeba, we have additional questions lining up. So give us time for a second round. Mr. Adeba, please.
I will certainly do that. Thank you. And thanks to those who posed their questions and comments. I will start with the last one, Brian H. And I hope you're not Brian Hook in disguise asking this question. How to change strategies. I'm not proposing that the EU should change its strategy. The title of this webinar suggests this in a way, and I may have fallen a bit too much in this camp in my initial remarks. But it's not about changing strategy as much as, say, the US government changed its policy with this current administration. That's like a real turnaround. What the Europeans should do or could do, as I suggest, is to adopt a broader strategy based on what they have been doing for the past 15, 17 years. As Barbara was recalling what happened in 2003, the goals that the Europeans have pursued then are still the goals that they pursue today. They don't want Iran to possess a nuclear weapon. They want to prevent another war in the region to emerge, and they want to be engaging as a relevant global actor. And that's fair. The question is how to do this now. And this is where I'm saying that the focus on the nuclear file and on defending the JCPOA is too narrow. It's not too narrow out of principle, it's too narrow because it doesn't work. Adnan, you quoted a Spanish diplomat. I could quote Winston Churchill here saying that However beautiful the strategy is, from time to time, you need to look at the results. And here, what the Europeans have tried, and and also in the questions, you mentioned the hesitation of companies to engage. What Europe has tried is, has achieved, is not what it wanted to achieve. It is always something, because we talk about the JCPOA with what who's half dead in life preservation IC unit, whatever you can call it, it's still there. So that's an achievement. But basically, the Europeans have been waiting out the Trump administration, hoping that there will be a different result in November. And if we're honest, we know that we have no idea what we should do with the second Trump administration. I mean, you can look at the months until then, and you know that it's going to be hard to reach November 3rd with a nuclear deal intact and with the United Nations Security Council intact, if you just look at what might happen around the arms embargo and the snapback of sanctions. So already preserving these things until November 3rd would be another achievement. But we can't stop there. We have to get into an initiative of what else should be done. And here, my suggestion simply is about regionalizing. This is in the nature of European foreign policy anyway. This is what Europe tried to do to broaden the agenda with Iran after the JCPOA was signed, to bring in environmental affairs, energy affairs, exchanges, people-to-people contacts. This is what the EU would do anyway. And it should also take a regional look at Iran and not just at the country itself. Just one remark about Jutta Gutland's question about being independent. I don't think that there is a majority, at least among policymakers and probably not in the populations, to be independent of the United States. There is lots of talk about this, but at least I cannot see this for the moment that Europe wants to be independent. We'd like to work with the United States. We like to be on the same page because there is so much more that Europe and the United States can achieve together, witness the JCPOA. So there isn't actually a willingness to be fully independent. And this can be seen when we precisely look at the situation of companies. I would not ask companies to be more courageous than the governments. European governments haven't pushed through the $15 billion credit line. They are loath to push through the IMF $5 billion credit. They are not taking the, for, again, understandable reasons, because there is so much at play in the transatlantic alliance, but they are not taking this confrontation to the limit. And they're not giving companies assurances that, yes, we would pay the bill if you trade with Iran and you get fined, then we take up the bill. It's even hard to say what the bill exactly would be like. I don't want to imagine a European company suing whoever the European government, the member state government or the EU in front of a European court for the losses it has incurred in, loss of market access to the United States, loss of business, personal damages to people who their credit cards have been taken away. So this is endless. If the United States was really going after a company and a company could say, I did this for the European Union policies, we don't want to go down that route. And this is why the companies are not getting the support that they would need. And again, there are reasons for this. I'm not denying this, but this is why we cannot ask companies, as I say, to be more courageous than the governments. I'll stop there. I've got more points to say, but I'll weave them into the next round of answers.
Great. And the next round of questions starts now. Sebastian Stoting asks this question. As Iran pointed out in the past, upholding the JCPOA means basically their ability to sell oil, or practically for the EU countries to buy it. What do you think of pushing for alternative energy sources instead? I imagine, he says, a broad-scale EU/German investment in Iran, be it solar, wind, plus hydrogen, or will that not help around the central issue of Iran's respectable interests in trading its self-produced goods beyond oil? Then Michael Schmidt asks a very short question. Could there be a role for the European Investment Bank? And then there is a third question from David Milliman. It reads, don't you think Iran knows the EU's stance already? If the EU stands alone, won't that give Iran the impression that EU favors their stance and give them more encouragement to defy US sanctions and possibly increase or embolden them for asymmetrical attacks? Maybe we should aim positive campaigns that talk directly to the people of Iran versus the Iranian government. Maybe we should target the Iranian youth more to gain their support instead of constantly battling their government that seems to be a stalemate. Thoughts, opinions from the experts? Then I would like to add a few questions from my own side. And my questions focus on your idea, Mr. Adeba, about new initiatives from the European side. I'd like to ask, and sometimes I'm trying to play the devil's advocate, but are we really prepared for such an initiative? When I look at Instex, for instance, as far as I know, 8 European member states plus an EFTA country have joined Instex. So is that a credible enough starting point? Wouldn't we have to first make an effort to be more inclusive and to show that we mean business with Instex? At the moment, I think we're just happy that we had one transaction, so we could prove that it could work, but then we went back to rest. Sorry, that sounds cynical, but maybe it is cynical. And shouldn't we gain more respectability and more trustworthiness by first investing more into Instex? Second, why would there be any takers for your initiative, Mr. Adeba, in the other countries in the Gulf region? From the point of view of the UAE or Saudi Arabia, isn't it great that everybody focuses on Iran? Iran's the problem, so they're happy. Now you say, okay, you guys also have problems and we want to deal with you also. Why would they want to invite you to do that? Wouldn't that dilute the focus that they're happy with? Then what leverage would the EU have? What could we offer to the different actors in the region? Then how much would that possibly be a convincing approach before the election has decided whether it will be Biden or Trump in the White House? I mean, if there would be Biden, as Mrs. Slavin has said, then there might be possibly more cooperation again between the US administration and the Europeans. And in that case, we wouldn't talk about European independence or European emancipation from the US. We would talk about US and Europe together trying to come up with meaningful policies. That would be a completely different framework than having still the same president in the White House and Europe trying to make amends. So why would anybody buy into such an initiative at this moment? And then other questions like, what are the internal shifts in Iran? Ernest said in the beginning that the conservatives have made inroads. How does that come into play? I mean, Iran is not monolithic, so how does, and last question, the Israeli-Palestinian dynamic. With the annexation plan that is now being pursued by the Israeli coalition, this could create a whole new game in that part of the world. If the Israelis would annex the Jordan Valley, Jordan might refuse overflight rights to the Israeli Air Force after that. So the whole game would change in the region. How does that come into play? So a wide variety of questions, and Ernest also wanted to ask a question. Ernest.
Well, you signaled the two things that I wanted to ask, but just to insist on that, I think I fully sympathize with the idea of trying to regionalize the dialogue. But for the EU to be successful on that, we need partners on the ground. Otherwise, I see it very difficult how we will be able to achieve that. And like Reinhard, I see very few. I can't imagine a lot of interest around the neighbors of Iran to jump that into such an initiative. So this is more a question for Cornelius, who thought about that, because I sympathize with the idea about how to achieve this. This is not very evident to me. And secondly, exactly Adnan was pointing what Reinhard said before, what is shifting in Iran and what do you expect after November if we have a different administration in the White House? Because everybody expects, okay, if there is a change in November, back to business. But that, of course, doesn't seem to be the case. Well, what exactly should be doing now to prepare that ground, if possible? Because this is what we should be asking ourselves. If there is a change in the US government in November, how to prepare the ground to restart the dialogue and the framework. So I think this is something that would be good also for you to reflect. Thank you.
Thank you, Ernest. This time, I think Adnan Tabatabai should go first.
I was hoping you don't start with me, but it's fine. I will obviously start to entertain some of these extremely interesting questions. I think the first question by Sebastian Stolting, I think was his name. I remember very well in the immediate aftermath of the JCPOA, there have been a lot of particularly German companies who were interested in investing into Iran's solar sector, let's put it this way, or renewable energies. And there has been an appetite in Iran to do so, as Iran has, due to sanctions, and that's the, I don't want to say blessing of sanctions because that sounds cynical, but Iran was forced to diversify its economy, be less oil dependent than other countries, hold in higher regard renewables to some extent. But particularly in renewables, it needs European investment. And unfortunately, with the JCPOA and the issues that came after it, that was no longer possible to have the kind of investments. I mean, the number of MOUs that were signed in 2015 and 2016 was enormous, but none of those memoranda of understanding really led to an actual contract because everyone was in waiting mode until elections in the US, elections in Iran, and then basically it was too late. There was this notion of the EU being encouraging Iran to be more defiant towards the US, and I don't think that is in the calculus of the Iranian political class. They won't be defiant towards the US if the Europeans encourage them to do so or not. So it's not as if Europe is really having Iran's back, by no means. And by having the European Union high representatives, be it Federica Mogherini or Josep Borrell, speaking in support of the JCPOA, being more explicit against the US approach, these are important symbolic gestures, but this is not what juices up Iranian defiance towards the US. So in that respect, don't worry. Speaking directly to Iranians means that you are seen as being a credible actor. And unfortunately, there is no credible, consistent European human rights approach. There is no consistent European approach towards events that we saw in the past 2 weeks in the US. Just to cite the German government spokesman Stefan Seibert, he in a press conference said that there is no need for the German government, I'm paraphrasing it, I'm not quoting him, but he was basically saying there is no need for the German government to be explicit about the protests and the crackdown, the brutal crackdown of the police. because the democratic aspirations in the US are intact and everything is put on the table, everything is discussed. We are basically speaking about a country with the rule of law, and that's why the German government doesn't have to say anything. Unfortunately, the sub-message of this is that Iranian democracy advocates or Iranian human rights advocates inside the country cannot be taken that seriously. That's why the Germans have to speak up in support of them or to be more explicit about. So this doesn't work. This kind of double standard messaging doesn't work and has done a lot of harm with regards to credibility in messaging towards Iranians. Having said that, cultural exchange, scientific exchange, where actual Iranian and German and European researchers, scholars, cultural musicians, artists, etc. These kinds of things are important and should go on, and they are in fact ongoing, which is a very positive thing. And that links the societies together, and that would create a social realm for more proximity between Europe and Iran. This should definitely continue. I'm eating up too much time, I'm sorry, but I have to go to answer the question about internal shifts in Iran. Yes, of course. I mean, you had a government that came into place in 2013. It was from the moderates camp, the Etedaliyun, reformist leaning, not a reformist government, but at least reformist leaning. They had promised to improve ties with Europe, with the West, to boost the economy, and for a zillion reasons, they failed to do so. And it's very, very natural that the pendulum swings back to the conservatives or the so-called principlist camp now, which has been saying all the time, we told you so, this won't work, etc., etc. So obviously today you cannot make the case for outreach to Europe or the West in Iran without that being political suicide. And that has certainly shifted. And if you look at what Foreign Minister Javad Zarif or President Hassan Rouhani have said in the past 1 or 2 years, they themselves are becoming more hawkish towards Europe, more disappointed about Europe. So even those who were proponents of outreach have been disappointed, and that certainly won't make it easier by any stretch to seek outreach to Iran. And that's certainly a problem that can only be compensated by what I mentioned earlier, being clear in Europe as to what Europe wants, pushing back against US pressure in that respect. And maybe my final point, in slight disagreement with Cornelius, would be the US government is not just against the JCPOA and against Iran, it is also against the European Union's role in this mess. It is explicitly anti-European Union. It's the government. I'm speaking about the government. There are other Europeanists in Washington, Barbara being one of them, if I may say so. But this government has a real issue with Europe, has a real issue with the European Union. And that dimension of the current problem needs to be taken much more seriously in Brussels. It's not as if we are friends and disagree over country X. It's really that the US is also pushing back against the EU's prominent role in these issues. I took a lot of time, sorry for that.
No, you filled your time well. Thank you very much. I would now go to Mr. Adibar, please.
Thank you, and thanks again for the questions. I feel I should in particular address the ones you, Reinhard Bütikofer, and Ernest Utterson addressed to me, which should give a little bit more flesh to the bare bone of the proposal that I made initially. I do recognize, and I'm grateful for, as you said, the sympathy that you have for this proposal, because it means that ultimately we could agree on the fact that there ought to be maybe an adjustment in the strategy, and possibly, again, regionalization could be one way to go. And the question simply is, how do we do that? And I fully agree, and I also see the questions that you raised. First of all, are we prepared? No, we're not prepared. The European Union is still somehow stuck in this mantra that we need to save the JCPOA, and we somehow need to enable trade to do that, because if only we can do trade with Iran, then everything will fall back into the place. But it will not. Iran has moved on over the past two years, and as Adnan was saying, and there is not even a disagreement, as he was saying, Washington is very hostile towards the Europeans on this file. So we don't see this, we don't yet address this. And this is something where we're certainly not prepared. When I say we, it's the EU and the 27 member states. We've just lost an important member state, the UK, which is still part of the E3, where there is hope, but also uncertainty for how long the E3 will persist as a unity. And that's, of course, an important value in and of itself. I mean, despite what is going on in the Brexit negotiations, it is crucial for the Europeans to sit together around the table with the UK on such an important issue. And there are reasons why the Europeans would not want to divide this small format. But of course, the United Kingdom has different relations with the Gulf neighbors, and France has different relations with the Gulf neighbors than, say, Germany or Italy. And this is where the problems may start. What is the interest in the Gulf, you were asking? Yes, I would say the Gulf neighbors, they used to be happy about the anti-Iran mood, in particular coming from Washington, but also from Tel Aviv. Obviously, there's been renewed talk about an Israeli-Arab axis against Iran. But over the past 12 months, most probably or most precisely, this has shifted because it's been a bit too much anti-Iran, or at least it's been too much response from Iran against this maximum pressure policy. So the attacks on tankers, where there has been an official inquiry, including the countries that were attacked, the United Arab Emirates, and this official report did not point the finger at Iran. It only said that must have been a state-sponsored attack. And after the attacks on the Aramco installations on Saudi Arabian soil, when the United States Secretary of State came out saying, well, this is basically a Saudi problem and this is none of our business, also the other countries in the region realized that maybe they will not have America's back when it comes to really provoking Iran. So the Arab states, the Gulf states themselves have been making outreach to Iran. The UAE sent a delegation to Tehran to talk about maritime security. This is something we would not have imagined a year or two ago. Why? Because they see that Iran can become a problem for them, precisely what Tehran had intended with its aggressive policies. And they see that ultimately the maximum pressure policy may not succeed, and even worse, from an Arab point of view, Trump may not be re-elected. So there is a moment also now where grounds are shifting in the region, and this is what I believe the Europeans should seize. Do we have leverage? Well, again, you can build leverage if you have a solid proposal to make and invest in it. Money, which the EU usually puts at a problem, is probably not the most crucial issue with Gulf states, even though under current conditions with COVID and with a decline in the oil price, maybe a few $1 billion for joint projects would also help in that region if you invested them wisely. But attention is another leverage that the EU could bring. How many EU delegations do we have around the Gulf? Not many. 3, if I'm counting correctly, and 2 have been opened only recently and are at a very small scale. So bringing simply more attention to the region, catering to their, not catering, but taking into account their interests, their needs, engaging them in a conversation at high level. I'm not going to go into the details of the countries there, but this is something which could help build the European leverage. Ultimately, vis-a-vis those countries, they also want to contain Iran, and the proposal that I'm making includes elements that regulations that are currently only apply to Iran and which are time-bound could be extended indefinitely at a regional level. So these are the famous sunset clauses which people in Washington and Israel worry about a lot. I don't see a way to, say, peacefully, diplomatically extend these sunset clauses indefinitely, but if they became part of a regional arrangement where all countries would subscribe to them, say, either no enrichment, or if you already have an enrichment program, no enrichment beyond 3.5%, and make this a regional standard. Or some of the regulations that the IAEA can apply under the additional protocol starting with the additional protocol, I should say, that all countries around the Persian Gulf should sign and implement the additional protocol, like Iran is doing under the JCPOA. So this is not so much about, when I say it is about including the Arab countries and posing some restrictions on them, that's true, but it would be a way to also constrain and more thoroughly constrain Iran also into the future. And my last point on this is, no, 2 points. One is regarding the internal shifts. We can build with this on an initiative that the current Iranian government, Hassan Rouhani, President, and Foreign Minister Zarif have made. It's called the HOPE Initiative. It stands for Homo's Peace Endeavor. It's not about, fully taking it on, but it is responding to this by valuing such a proposition that was made in a way one could value a proposition that the GCC made in the mid-2000s when it comes to weapons of mass destruction around the Persian Gulf, not the bigger framework within the Middle East, but around the Persian Gulf. So responding to ideas, valuing ideas that have also been developed in the region would be another important element that could help develop leverage. And lastly, very practically, because how could the European Union do all this with the limited bandwidth of people and the apparatus? I come to think of an EU special representative for the Persian Gulf region as a way to deal with this. It should be, of course, a very senior figure which commands respect in the region at the level of the interlocutors. It would not be, it would free the High Representative to pursue the many other projects which are on Josep Borrell's desk. It wouldn't be different from the work that the current Secretary General, Helga Schmidt, has done, which was more exclusively focused on the JCPOA and the Joint Commission. But it would help the European Union start this initiative, develop policy proposals, bring in member states. An EU special representative would have to be tasked by the Council to conduct his or her work. So you would have to have member states present him or her with a mandate, which could be formulated. And we could do this by building on the mandate that the Foreign Affairs Council gave to Josep Borrell in January, after the killing of General Soleimani, that he should engage the region in political dialogue. So we do have a mandate from the member states there. This could be further developed into a mandate for an EUSR for the Persian Gulf region, and who could then take care of the building the leverage, building relations with member states, with the United States, if and when there is a different president, obviously, but most importantly also with countries in the region.
Thank you. Mrs. Slavin, we have about 11 minutes left, so don't be shy expressing yourself at some length. But there will be one more question, I think. Please go ahead.
Sure. So much has already been covered. I go back to what Ernest asked, how to prepare the ground. Again, the experience we had 2003 to 2005, when the United States was not talking to Iran, when they were at loggerheads in Iraq and over the nuclear issues, and Europe prepared the ground. You can prepare the ground. You should have, your first job is to preserve whatever is left of the JCPOA until our elections. And hopefully we will have a different government. But let me remind you that even the second Bush administration took a different approach toward Iran than the first, and actually joined the negotiations. I think another very important point, Cornelius alluded to this, is that the countries of the Persian Gulf now understand that the United States it's leaving. It's reducing its footprint in the region. It had been on a rise during the Iran-Iraq War, and then after, of course, the first Gulf War, pushing the Iraqis out of Kuwait, and then the invasion of Iraq in 2003, this enormous U.S. military buildup is going in an opposite direction.
Mm.
And everybody understands this, and this will continue whether it's Trump 2 or it's Biden. U.S. forces are leaving Afghanistan. U.S. forces have already reduced their numbers in Iraq, and you know, the United States has just started a new discussion with the Iraqis about the continued U.S. military presence there. And I think the Iraqi government is going to make sure that it's a very small U.S. footprint, and that this time it really is focused on training and countering ISIS, and that we're not going to be settling more scores against Iran on Iraqi soil, because these sorts of actions make it impossible for Iraq to have any kind of sovereignty. It's difficult enough as it is. So I think we're pushing, Cornelius is in a way pushing on an open door here, with the willingness of GCC states to talk about some sorts of regional arrangements. He mentioned the Iranian initiative, Hope. Well, I don't know how much hope there is in Hope, but we do have other models and precedents. We have the resolution that ended the Iran-Iraq War, which specifically authorized the UN Secretary General to look into other ways to ensure regional peace and stability. So the UN could take up this mandate in conjunction with the EU. We have the OECD, which was used during the Cold War, a variety of ways in which the region could be encouraged to talk to each other. We already have Kuwait and Oman, and to some extent the UAE, which are functioning as mediators. So the problem really is Saudi Arabia. And you know, this oil shock that has been caused, the collapse in demand because of the coronavirus, gives us leverage, frankly, with the Saudis. Saudis can't afford the war in Yemen. They can't afford this military buildup anymore. They can't afford to have this arms race with Iran, or even this intervention race with Iran. So I think there are ample chips there that the EU, the UN can begin to work with. And then, you know, with this as a basis, there's something for the United States to jump on board with and support. Especially if we have Biden, but even if we don't, because Donald Trump doesn't like being in the Middle East. He thinks this is a waste of U.S. resources. He likes selling weapons, but he certainly doesn't like having U.S. troops there. And the message has been communicated that the United States cannot be relied on. Frankly, we've seen that economic pressure alone is not sufficient, and there is no military muscle really behind this. You know, assassinating Qasem Soleimani was shocking, but it's not really a military strategy. Beyond that, Reinhard, I totally endorse this idea of more investment in Instex. This is for you guys. You can do this. There are government investment funds, export credit agencies, European financial institutions of all sorts that can put their money where their mouth is. It's not enough just to have had one transaction as a proof of concept. So this is on you, and you know, you don't have to use it as a way to circumvent sanctions. You can do more in the areas that are not sanctioned, simply to prove that this is a mechanism that works. You can work with the Chinese. They're continuing to trade with Iran. Make common cause with China on this particular issue. U.S. sanctions policy, you know, I always say it's like antibiotics. If you overuse sanctions, like antibiotics, they lose their efficacy. And the U.S. is running amok. And it's not just Iran. As you well know, European companies are threatened because of Russia, because of other issues. So do European countries have their own foreign policy, or are they just going to kowtow to the United States forever? You have seen with the Trump administration the extreme form of this. And of course, our Congress is hyperactive when it comes to sanctions as well. So I think it's really now or never for Europe to say, no, there are limits to how much you can try to determine our foreign and economic policies. So perhaps let me leave it there. and leave the last two minutes to whoever else needs it.
Look, I will try to fit in the last two questions that have popped up, and I will give then each of our experts roughly a minute max. One question from Salma Sulifikar. Can you tell us what progress has been made on human rights? Is there an opportunity now during COVID-19 to change the strategy and also make improvement on human rights? How can the global health crisis help change this approach? And the second question, again, is from David Milliman. Do you see the possibility in the near future, 5 years or less, the Iranian population protesting their own government more, calling for a more democratic Western model, and the government giving in and taking less of a hard stance? It seems the Iranian and Saudi populations are in a sort of race to freedoms, women driving, etc. Could a revolution start from within? 1 minute each. Barbara Slavin first.
Okay. I think that U.S. policy of maximum pressure has undercut the Iranian desire for reform and human rights. When you have an external enemy essentially threatening your very survival, that gives power to those who are the most repressive. So if we really want to help the reform movement in Iran, we should, as Javad Zarif has said, take the sanctions foot off the neck of Iran to bring it back to our own human rights situation in the United States. We have taken the absolute wrong approach. And the first event we had at the Atlantic Council after the JCPOA went in was about how to promote human rights in Iran. Once we go back into compliance, once we end this quarrel with Europe and with Iran, then we'll be in a better position to support Iranians' desire for more freedom.
Thank you. Mr. Tabatabai, 1 minute, 50 seconds.
Okay. Well, I think the protests in Iran will certainly continue. I mean, the economic grievances it will take a lot of time for those to be really taken care of properly. And I think when you are outside of Iran, what you only have to look at is what does your country, what do other European or Western countries do that either support or make life more difficult for Iranians. And that is the one focus that I believe everyone from outside Iran should have. And Barbara made excellent points in that respect that I won't need to repeat. What I mentioned earlier about the disappointment of the German statement towards Black Lives Matter in Iran, Black Lives Matter in the US, you have a very healthy civil rights movement in Iran that works in different ways than you would work if you are in European countries, and my trust is with them to basically make sure that the responsibility of any state towards its population in Iran will actually really be furthered. And for that to happen, I think external pressure really has to be tuned down, because otherwise it's additional pressure to what the Iranians are already going through.
Okay, Cornelius Adebar, also 50 seconds.
Thank you. And agreeing with what my dear colleagues have said, I simply want to conclude on this question of what can the Europeans do to help the people of Iran. I don't think that this is a question of direct meddling or fomenting unrest or wishing for the unrest to boil over. It's certainly possible in any time frame, 5 years, 10 years, 2 years, that things happen in countries around the world, not just Iran. What the Europeans should do is have a consistent policy that is respectful of the people and of the other of the treaties that it enters, the agreements that it has entered, that is working with not just Iran but with the neighbors, and is not being pushed around by one ally / superpower, but which is consistent with its own goals. That would already help, and it would heighten the respect that the Europeans get.
Thank you. I have 30 seconds for my last 4 sentences. First, I want to thank our experts for their great insights they shared with us. Thank you very much. I want to thank also Ernest and our staff for their good cooperation. I think we have learned one lesson, that we should take home, which is that there is more space for creating European agenda in the region, and we should look at that more in depth. I also believe that we have to take we have to address the aggressive role in the region that Iran plays beyond the JCPOA. Also, regardless of who wins the presidency in Washington, that will remain on the agenda. And the last point, maybe, Ernest, we should look at what we could do in the European Parliament to support the emergency support request for Iran from the IMF. With that, I would like again to thank everybody and wish you a good evening.
Thank you so much.
Of course, thanks to our participants also, of course.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.